Hello, my name is Fred Hayden and chose to cover the Battle of Kings Mountain. Okay, now we need to understand why the battle happened and understand, the battle itself. We got Major Patrick Ferguson over here to the left-hand side. He went through South Carolina, as the first quote shows, having great success in recruiting American colonists to join his loyalist militia, shown on the right-hand side, just being a loyalist militiaman. Now, the second quote kind of shows how Ferguson was being harassed by North Carolina militia under Colonel Isaac Shelby and Colonel Charles McDowell. They were harassing the British militia as they were working their way north as part of the western wing or flank of Cornwallis's invasion of North Carolina in 1780. Now you see in the bottom, the third quote, or the third bullet, that from Gilbertown, he sent a message, Ferguson did, to the elusive Overmountain stating, "If you do not detest your opposition to British arms, I shall march this army over the mountains, hang your leaders, and lay waste to your country with fire and sword." Now, the Patriot militias did not respond well to this. Shelby and McDowell called on Patriot militias nearby, even as far as Virginia and Tennessee, and they all came together to fight Ferguson on their own terms. The picture and the quote kind of show a little more about the men. It said they were skilled hunters and woodsmen, but they lacked military discipline, and the British just dismissed them because they weren't disciplined soldiers, but they proved to be very effective in the Battle of Kings Mountain. Okay, now the battle itself, we kind of see a map right up here and show the legend. Now these men came from the north and went south. You see right there, Kings Mountain's in the bottom corner. Ferguson was trying to evade apprehension, as he found out later from the two deserters of Seaver's party at Yellow Mountain Gap, that the Patriot militia was right on his heels. He was trying to make it to Charlotte right there next to Kings Mountain. You can see that in the bottom corner over there, to get to Cornwallis and to get to reinforcements. He actually called for reinforcements himself on October 6th once he knew he'd be apprehended. Now the colonels, I should say, of these militias, since they were volunteer, they could elect someone to lead the forces, and they elected Colonel Campbell to command once they were at Gilberton. Okay, now the next slide, I want to show two pictures. The first one being the summit of the mountain, and the second one being a trail on the way up. Now you gotta realize Ferguson had a view from the top of the mountain. He was firing down with his men. He was encamped up top, while the Patriot militias had to storm up the mountain. I want to say like Iwo Jima, but they had to go up the hill. It was hard for them to go up like that. Now, one particular quote I want to share, one that Ferguson is actually infamous for, is this quote: "This is King's Mountain, and I am king of this mountain. God Almighty and all the rebels of hell cannot drive me from it." He's actually still on this mountain, as he was buried up there after he was killed trying to retreat, along with two other Tory lieutenants. Now, right here, the second one is the second quote, just more about the terrain, saying it's about 60 feet above the surrounding terrain, which is good for defending, as he pointed out. The area was oblong, with about 120 to 60 yards across, is covered in rocks and trees, as the Patriots had to fight their way up. I'll go to the next slide. Now, we see two maps here. The first one coming from Kings Mountain National Military Park. The white rectangles, as the legend shows, are just the colonels, Patriot colonels, fighting their way up the mountain. The oblong shape is actually kind of the hilly mountain. Now, the darkened rectangles represent the British encampment, or the British forces, and the triangles are the encampment, kind of right in there. So it shows you how the battle was fought as they all went up the mountain. This picture, I think, is a better illustration, because you see that there was like 6 or 7 different colonels, maybe more, for the Patriots, while there was only like one major commander, which was Patrick Ferguson for the British. The next one. Now, this picture down here, before I get to the quote, shows Colonel Cleveland as he took a war prize from Ferguson, being his horse. As Ferguson was dead, he took the horse, as a war prize, and that in a victory. Now here, it says about 700 riflemen were sent to apprehend him. They were right on his heel. They rode day and night just to catch him right before he'd get to Charlotte. And he knew, they were coming, so he chose to fight on Kings Mountain, as shown by the first-hand source right there. Okay. Now, Ferguson has said and this picture in particular is actually a pretty good picture. Shows the three right there charging. Ferguson being on a horse right there, he wore a particular garb, and he was, specific enough to get shot at. They knew what he was wearing. They were trying to shoot specifically for him. The other two Tory lieutenants were right there, trying to retreat as well, and they were also cut down on their way down the mountain by the Patriot forces. Now, it said he tried to suppress all forms of surrender, but once he was shot, they eventually just threw down their arms. Now, unfortunately, during this time, as they threw down their arms, it took the Patriots a while to realize, the surrender. Some of them didn't care, as they were, they wanted to inflict harm on them from from what had happened across the countryside, them destroying everything. And it took the colonels themselves to get up to the front line to actually draw the ceasefire out. I'll move on to the next line. Okay. Right here, we kind of see the surrender of the British right here on top. There's only about 100 regulars. There was, I think, about 1,000 men. There's like 800 some captured, 150 wounded, 150 killed. We'll see that number here in just a second. And the Patriot forces had about 1,000, 1,100 or so themselves. They had a couple hundred, 300 following on foot, and about 700 or so actually going toward the British forces. So you see right here, it said the loyalists at the time of their surrender were driven into a crowd, and being closely surrounded, they could not make any further resistance, which you see that at the time. Okay, the immediate aftermath we see right here is Ferguson on his horse and the Patriots working their way up. There was about 150 of Ferguson's party killed, something of that wounded, 810, 100 of which were British regulars, were prisoners. About 30 Americans were killed and about 50 some wounded. So it was actually a really successful victory for the Americans, especially considering they were working their way up the hill. But they did have remarkable marksmen, and they did have cover of the tree line. Now, I said the engagement lasted for about an hour and 5 minutes, part of which was heavy fire on both sides. It was right on par. It was about an hour for most sources. Now, the total loss of the enemy, based on the official report, this is coming from Robert Campbell's collection of the, this eyewitness account of the event, saying there's about 1,105 men at Kings Mountain for the enemy that was lost. Now, the effects, we see that Cornwallis lost his left flank, a third of the invasion force. He had to halt the invasion of North Carolina, and he retreated from Charlotte back to Winnsboro, South Carolina. Now, they realized they could no longer depend on the Loyalist militia. Even though they underestimated the American militia, I guess they didn't underestimate the Loyalist militia. The Americans proved to be very, very capable. Now, the Battle of Cowpens followed just a couple months later in January 1781. One thing I want to show here is General Clinton's quote, just to kind of give you an emphasis. He was the commander-in-chief of North America, the British forces at the time, and he stated that the Battle of Kings Mountain was the first link in the chain of evils that ended in the total loss of America. Now, we got 3 monuments. I saw one of them right here in the lower left from TripAdvisor. Someone who visited the area for the Patriots right there, that monument. The second being the Centennial Monument that was erected in 1880, just kind of doing a memorial for the 100th year after the battle. And this is actually Major Patrick Ferguson's grave right there on top of the mountain. So it was actually pretty interesting. Pretty good battle, and then, you get to see the effects right after, which was the Battle of Cowpens. So I'll go on to the bibliography. Right there is my sources. Okay, and then I did have sources for the photos as well. If this thing will click. There we go. First one. And this